Some people plant potatoes in large garden beds, using expensive fertilizer and plenty of space. And when harvest time comes, they still pull out far less than they expected. Has that ever happened to you? Because it has happened to me more times than I'd like to admit. For years, I thought the problem was the soil. I blamed the climate. I blamed the seed potatoes. I blamed everything around me, while the answer was sitting right under my nose, actually, right under the ground, waiting for me to slow down and pay attention to what the older farmers had been trying to teach me all along. The first time I heard that it was possible to harvest more than 60 kilograms of potatoes from less than half a square meter of soil, I thought it sounded exaggerated. I figured it was one of those stories that grows bigger every time someone tells it. But then, someone told me where that method came from, and that changed my entire perspective. That knowledge didn't come from a laboratory. It didn't come from a university. It didn't come from an agronomist in a white coat. It came from the Amish. And when I say the Amish, I'm talking about people who never abandoned the land, who never traded practical knowledge for industrial shortcuts, and who never gave up what works just because something new came along. Today, I'm going to tell you exactly what I learned about this method, and why it produces results that seem almost impossible to people who grew up with modern farming logic. But before I explain how it works, you need to understand why most people will never discover this method on their own. Not because it's complicated, not because it requires special soil or rare seed, but because it goes completely against everything industrial agriculture has taught us to believe about how potatoes are supposed to grow. When I started growing potatoes seriously, slowly, patiently, without relying on commercial products, the first thing I noticed was that the plant doesn't want what we think it wants. We've been taught to think horizontally. Long rows, wide beds, spreading everything across the ground. But potatoes don't think that way. Potatoes think vertically. They want to grow upward, forming tubers along a stem that rises, expands, and keeps finding fresh soil with every inch it climbs. And that is exactly what the Amish understood generations ago, while the rest of the world moved in the opposite direction, spreading crops outward and losing what could have been gained in height. Many years ago, when I was still living on my father's small farm, I watched an older man plant potatoes in a way I had never seen before. He didn't open long rows. He didn't use a large plot. Instead, he chose a small patch of soil, dug deep, and started doing something I didn't understand at the time. I watched quietly without asking questions, the kind of silence that comes from being young and not wanting to look ignorant. But that man's harvest stayed in my memory for decades, not because of the amount he harvested, but because of the proportion. From a tiny space, he pulled out enough potatoes to fill large buckets, and for years I tried to understand how he had done it. The explanation started to make sense when I began studying how communities that historically depended on potatoes as a staple food approached cultivation. The Amish didn't invent this method out of thin air. They preserved and refined a principle built on a very simple question. If potatoes form tubers along the buried stem, what happens when you keep burying more of that stem gradually as the plant grows? The answer is what makes this method so powerful, and at the same time, so easy to apply. Before we continue, let me ask you something I've wondered about for a long time. Have you ever tried growing potatoes at home and ended up disappointed with the results? Have you invested time, energy, and hope into a garden bed only to harvest far less than you expected? There's no need to feel embarrassed about that. I've been there more than once, and I know many people watching this channel have experienced that same frustration. Planting the seed, watering it, caring for it, waiting patiently. And when harvest time comes, you feel like something went wrong, but you can't quite explain what it was. If that has happened to you, Or if it's happening right now, write it down in the comments. You can even copy this sentence and leave it below. I planted with hope and harvested less than I deserved. That helps other people reading the comments realize they're not alone in this struggle. And it helps me understand what you most want to learn, so this kind of frustration doesn't keep repeating. There's something important we need to talk about when it comes to the loneliness of people who try to grow their own food and can't find clear answers anywhere. Most people walk into a grocery store, grab a packaged product, take it home, and never think about what it took to produce it. But you, the person watching this video, are already past that stage. You want to learn how to produce your own food. And that takes courage most people don't have. It takes patience. It takes the willingness to make mistakes and learn from them. And it helps to have someone who has already walked that path and can show what actually works. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, I invite you to do that now. Not because I care about the numbers, but because here we're building something together. A library of old knowledge that is slowly disappearing. Every video I publish is an attempt to preserve something that modern agriculture has gradually pushed aside. By subscribing, you'll receive each new lesson that comes out. And I can promise you this: there is still a lot of powerful old knowledge left to bring into this conversation. Now, let me explain the central mechanism behind the Amish potato growing method. It's simple to understand, but the results can be remarkable. The principle starts with choosing vertical space instead of horizontal space. Instead of planting potatoes in shallow open beds, this method uses a container or structure that allows you to add soil gradually as the plant grows. It can be a wooden box, a circular structure made from boards, a cut barrel, or any container that allows you to keep adding layers of soil as the plant rises. The logic works like this. The potato seed is planted at the bottom of the container in a rich initial layer of soil. When the plant begins to grow and reaches about 8 inches above the soil, you add another layer of soil on top, covering part of the stem while leaving the leaves exposed. This forces the buried portion of the stem to form new tubers along the section that has been covered. When the plant grows another 8 inches, you repeat the process, and then again, layer by layer, until the container is full or the plant reaches the flowering stage, which signals that the tuber formation cycle is coming to an end. What happens beneath the soil during this process is something that took me years to truly understand. Every inch of stem that ends up buried has the ability to send out lateral roots, and from those roots, new tubers begin to form. In a conventional planting system, most of that stem remains exposed to the air or buried only at the original seed depth. In the Amish method, you gradually expand the amount of productive stem throughout the entire height of the container. The result is layered production. It's almost as if you don't have just a potato plant, but an entire vertical column of potatoes being produced one layer on top of another. This isn't magic, it isn't chemistry, and it doesn't rely on any special product. It's simply careful observation of how the plant behaves, taken to its logical conclusion. And that kind of observation is exactly what the Amish have cultivated over generations, because they never had the option of replacing knowledge with something bought at the store. When I first started applying this method on my own land, I used wooden crates I already had lying around. There was nothing special about the materials. The soil I used was the same soil I'd been working with for years, enriched with compost I make myself from kitchen scraps, and organic material from the property. I planted a single seed potato at the bottom of each crate and followed the process of covering the stem as the plant grew. At first, it feels like nothing is happening. The plant grows upward. You add soil. It grows again. You cover it again. It almost seems too simple to be effective. And that's exactly where most people give up. Our culture has trained us to expect fast, visible results. The Amish method asks for patience, but it rewards that patience generously. There is one part of this process that many people overlook, and it makes a huge difference in the final harvest. It isn't the container. It isn't the seed. It's the soil you add with each new layer. The Amish don't simply use ordinary soil thrown together without thought. They use a mixture designed to provide exactly what the potato stem needs to produce tubers: light structure, balanced moisture, and a generous amount of organic matter. Heavy soil, compacted soil, or soil with too much clay will make tuber formation difficult even if the rest of the method is followed correctly. The soil must be loose enough for the potatoes to expand without resistance, moist enough to sustain growth, but never so wet that it causes the developing tubers to rot. Over time, the mixture I learned to use became a blend of native soil from the land itself, well-aged compost, and light organic material such as partially decomposed dry leaves or fine straw. That combination creates a porous, rich, balanced environment similar to what potatoes would encounter in an old forest floor, where layers of organic matter have been building up naturally for years. There's nothing expensive about it, just observation and respect for the nature of the plant. Another detail that took me years to fully appreciate, and that almost nobody mentions when discussing this method, is the importance of sunlight during the progressive covering process. When you bury the stem and leave only the leaves exposed, those leaves must receive strong sunlight in order to carry out the photosynthesis that fuels tuber formation underground. A potato plant grown using the Amish method in partial shade will produce significantly less than one receiving at least 6 hours of direct sunlight each day. The buried stem depends entirely on the energy captured by the leaves above the soil. The more efficiently those leaves gather sunlight, the more productive every layer inside the container becomes. It sounds obvious when you think about it, but in practice, many people place the container in whatever corner of the backyard seems convenient without considering how much sun the plant will actually receive. Then they end up disappointed with the harvest. I've seen this happen many times. People applying the method correctly in every other way, but forgetting that sunlight is the engine behind the entire process. The potato variety you choose also affects the results far more than most people realize. Not every potato responds well to progressive soil covering. Varieties that grow tall, upright stems tend to perform best because tubers form along that buried stem as it develops. Varieties with a more spreading or low-growing habit usually produce less within this system because the stem doesn't extend upward enough to create multiple layers. Historically, Amish farmers selected and preserved specific potato varieties that respond particularly well to this technique. That knowledge of seed selection is itself a whole world of wisdom, one that industrial agriculture has nearly erased by standardizing crops into just a few commercial varieties. I mention this because I want you to understand something important. The method is powerful, but it doesn't exist in isolation. The right variety, the right soil mixture, the right sunlight exposure, the right rhythm of progressive covering. Each of these elements strengthens the others. And when you begin to observe how they interact, you start cultivating not just potatoes, but a deeper understanding of how nature works. There is something I always tell people who begin learning this method. The plant already knows what it needs to do. Your job isn't to force it. Your job is to create the conditions that allow it to do what it was designed to do. That shift in perspective completely changes your relationship with the land. Instead of fighting the nature of the plant, you begin working with it. And when you work with it, results that seem impossible from the outside become almost inevitable. I remember a conversation I had years ago with a man who had been growing potatoes for decades in rural Pennsylvania. He had never heard about the Amish method. He had never read about any technique like it. But through pure observation and experience, he had arrived at a practice remarkably similar to what I'm describing. He used old metal cans stacked on top of each other, covered the stems with leaf soil he collected along the edge of a wooded area, and harvested enough potatoes to fill baskets from a space that looked far too small to produce that much. When I asked him how he had learned to do that, he smiled and said, "I learned by watching the plant. It showed me what it wanted." That sentence stayed with me because it perfectly summarizes a principle that modern agriculture has largely abandoned: the principle of patient observation, the principle of letting the plant become the teacher. Modern science has enormous value. There's no doubt about that. But, along the way, it replaced observation with protocol, patience with products, and in doing so lost a kind of wisdom about the land that cannot be taught inside a classroom. The Amish preserved this relationship with the land not out of stubbornness or ignorance of the modern world, but because generation after generation they understood something essential. The soil responds to the right kind of care with a generosity that no industrial product can replace. When you plant with method, observation, and patience, the land gives back far more than you invested. And this isn't poetry. It's the practical result of decades of accumulated knowledge passed from hand to hand among people who depended on the land for survival. The progressive soil covering method the Amish developed and refined is not just a production technique. It's the expression of a philosophy about how humans relate to nature. It recognizes natural cycles, respects the rhythm of each plant, and trusts that careful observation reveals solutions that haste will never find. And that is exactly why this knowledge is so valuable today, in a world where speed has taken over everything and rushing has somehow become a virtue. Let me tell you what happens during harvest, because that's the moment when everything suddenly makes sense in a way that's difficult to describe with words. When you tip the container over or dismantle the structure at the end of the growing cycle, what you find is an entire column of potatoes arranged in layers, formed at every level where the stem had been buried. It isn't just a small cluster of potatoes at the base. Its production distributed vertically throughout the entire container, in a level of abundance that surprises even people who have done it before. Each layer of soil you added during the season became its own production zone, and the final harvest is simply the result of all those zones working together. That's the image I want you to keep in mind. A column of production, not a shallow garden bed, not a long row. A living column built layer by layer over time, one that turns a small space into a generous source of real food. For people with small backyards, balconies, or limited space, this method is especially meaningful. It doesn't require a large plot of land. It requires intelligence in how you use the space you already have. And that kind of intelligence isn't new. It existed long before us. It was practiced by generations who didn't have the option of expanding their land and had to produce as much as possible in the smallest possible area. What we're really doing here is relearning what they already knew. The subject of seed potatoes deserves special attention within this method. The Amish didn't buy new seed every year. They saved the best potatoes from each harvest to plant the following season. Over time, through this continuous process of selection, they developed varieties adapted to their climate, their soil, and their particular method of cultivation. Saving seed is knowledge in itself. It goes far beyond simply setting aside a potato to plant later. When you save seed, you are making a choice. You are telling nature which characteristics you want to preserve. A large, vigorous potato that produced well even under difficult conditions carries the genetic memory of that performance. By planting it again the next season, you are building on an adaptation that was earned in the previous harvest. Repeat that process for years, sometimes decades, and you gradually create a lineage of plants that is literally tailored to your specific soil, your specific climate, and your specific way of growing food. Industrial agriculture disrupted this process by centralizing seed production and promoting varieties that don't reproduce consistently from saved seed. When you buy certified seed every year, you hand over control of what you can plant to a company. When you save your own seed, you quietly and powerfully reclaim that control. I'm not saying every commercial seed is bad, or that modern varieties should always be rejected. What I am saying is that the practice of saving and selecting seed is valuable knowledge worth rediscovering. And the Amish potato method becomes even more powerful when combined with this kind of seed independence. Over time, you begin developing a potato line that responds particularly well to the progressive covering technique within your own environment. There is another aspect of the method that I rarely see discussed with the depth it deserves: the relationship between the timing of soil covering and the lunar cycle. The Amish, like many traditional farmers across the world, often planted and cultivated according to the lunar calendar. And there is a practical reason behind that practice, one that modern science is only beginning to explore. The moon influences the movement of fluids within the soil and within plants, just as it influences the tides. During the waxing moon, there tends to be greater movement of sap and nutrients toward the upper parts of the plant. During the waning moon, that energy tends to move downward, toward the roots and tubers. This has a direct implication for the progressive covering method. Adding soil over the stem during a waning moon means the newly buried stem receives the plant's natural tendency to push energy downward, precisely when you are creating a new zone for tuber formation. It's not an absolute rule. It's not exact science, but it is an observation farmers accumulated across generations, and when applied consistently, the difference can be noticeable. I didn't learn this from a book or from a course. I learned it from an elderly woman who kept a garden behind her house and never seemed to mistime her crops. When I asked what her secret was, she simply said she listened to the moon. At the time, I thought it sounded like superstition. Today, I recognize it as empirical wisdom built over decades of careful observation. Fertilization within the Amish method also deserves a closer look. Instead of applying concentrated fertilizer all at once, the idea is to enrich each new layer of soil as it is added during the plant's growth. This ensures the plant has access to nutrients in every zone where tubers are forming, not just at the base where the seed potato was first planted. Well-aged compost rich in organic matter, applied in the right proportion with each new layer, creates a continuously nourishing environment that sustains production throughout the entire cycle. There is another advantage as well. This approach prevents the excessive nitrogen levels that often occur when growers apply fertilizer in large quantities all at once. Too much nitrogen encourages excessive leafy growth above ground while reducing tuber development below ground, which is exactly the opposite of what you want when growing potatoes. By distributing nutrients layer by layer, you maintain a balance that favors tuber production without overstimulating the growth of stems and leaves above the soil. Water management in this method is actually simpler than it appears, but it requires attention to one specific detail. Because the crop grows in a container or enclosed structure, proper drainage at the bottom is essential to prevent water from accumulating and rotting both the seed potato and the developing tubers. At the same time, soil inside a container tends to dry out faster than soil in open ground, especially in the upper layers where exposure to sun and wind is greater. The practical rule I learned is to check the moisture in the top layers before watering. Simply insert your finger into the soil up to the second knuckle. If the soil still feels moist, there's no need to water yet. If it feels dry to the touch, it's time to add water. The amount of water needed varies depending on the size of the container, the climate, and the stage of plant growth. During the early stage, when the plant is still small, water demand is relatively low. As the foliage expands and the plant enters its intense tuber-forming phase, water consumption increases significantly. During this stage, maintaining consistent moisture becomes especially important. because sharp fluctuations between dry and saturated soil can cause cracked potatoes or uneven tuber development. Everything I'm describing here was learned over years of observation, mistakes, adjustments, and trying again. There is no shortcut to this kind of knowledge, but there is the possibility of learning from someone who has already walked that path, and that's exactly what I'm trying to offer here. Every detail I share is an attempt to compress years of experience into practical information that you can apply right now. And there is something important I want you to understand about this learning process. You don't have to get everything right the first time. Nobody does. The Amish method wasn't developed by people who succeeded immediately. It was developed by people who observed, adjusted, and repeated until they understood what the plant was asking for. You have that same ability. What you need is the willingness to observe, the patience to wait for results, and the humility to learn from what didn't work. This leads me to something I consider fundamental in the relationship with the land: respect for failure as part of the process. In my entire life, working with food production, I have never met an experienced farmer who didn't have stories of failed harvests, disappointing seasons, or plantings that didn't go as planned. Those failures are not signs of incompetence. They are inseparable from learning. Anyone who avoids failure never learns deeply, because failure is the most honest teacher the land has. A farmer who tries to avoid failure by using industrial inputs to solve every problem is, in reality, replacing learning with artificial control. And that control comes with a cost. There is a financial cost, a cost to the soil, a cost to the quality of the food produced, and a cost to the independence of the grower who becomes dependent on those inputs. The Amish understood this instinctively because they never had that alternative available. And because of that, they developed knowledge that is resilient, knowledge that was tested without a safety net. When you grow potatoes using the method I'm describing, without products to cover mistakes, and without inputs to compensate for what you didn't observe, you develop a sensitivity that is priceless. You begin to read the color of the leaves, the texture of the soil, the behavior of the plant in every stage of its cycle. You begin to understand that nature is communicating all the time with those who are willing to listen. And once you develop that ability to read the land, it goes far beyond potatoes. It transforms the way you relate to every plant, every harvest, and every growing season. That may be the greatest legacy the Amish have to offer the modern world. Not just a planting technique, but a posture toward nature that creates knowledge passed down from generation to generation. A posture that says, nature knows more than I do, and my job is to learn its language. There is something that deeply motivates these conversations I have with you here on the channel. It's not just about sharing techniques. It's about the feeling that together we are recovering a relationship with the land that was almost lost. Every person who learns to produce their own food through old knowledge like this is performing a quiet but powerful act of resistance. You are saying you don't want to depend completely on a system you don't control just to access basic food. You are saying you believe in humanity's ability to work with nature instead of trying to dominate it. And that has value far beyond the number of pounds of potatoes harvested. It has value measured in autonomy, in health, and in connection with cycles that existed long before us and will continue long after us. And when you pass that knowledge to someone else, a child, a neighbor, a friend who asks what you're doing with that wooden box in the backyard, you are helping ensure that this knowledge continues to live. The Amish understand this better than almost anyone. For them, agricultural knowledge does not belong to individuals. It is a shared inheritance meant to be protected and passed on. Every young person who learns to grow potatoes using the traditional method receives more than a technique. They receive a way of seeing the world, a way of relating to the land, and an understanding that true food security does not come from having money to buy food, but from knowing how to produce food with what nature provides. The relationship between space and production revealed by this method also challenges a very common belief in modern agriculture: the idea that you need vast amounts of land to produce meaningful quantities of food. That belief benefits large-scale industrial producers, but it does not reflect the reality of careful, knowledge-based cultivation in small spaces. A well-managed garden, using techniques like the Amish potato method, can produce more food per square foot than a mechanized field relying on the same industrial inputs. I'm not exaggerating to encourage you. I'm telling you what I've seen with my own eyes over decades of working with the land. Productivity is not determined solely by the amount of space you have. It is determined by the knowledge you apply to the space you have. And that principle is incredibly liberating, especially for people who live in cities, have small backyards, or want to begin producing food without access to large farmland. When you apply the Amish method in a container of about 1.5 square feet and harvest more than 130 pounds of potatoes, you're not just saving money. You're proving to yourself that knowledge is more valuable than inputs. You're making a discovery that changes the way you see food production. And that discovery doesn't stay limited to potatoes. It spreads to everything else you grow afterward, because you start asking the right question. What does this plant need? And what can I learn to provide it? I know many of you watching this video are just getting started. Maybe this is the first time you've thought about growing something beyond a small herb pot on a kitchen windowsill. Maybe you arrived here out of curiosity, or necessity, or because something in the world started feeling off, and you realized you needed another way. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know something important. You're in the right place, and a beginning doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Take whatever container you have available. It could be an old bucket, a large metal can, a wooden crate, or even a reused feed sack. Fill the bottom with a mixture of loose soil and organic compost. Plant a seed potato with the eyes facing upward. Water moderately. Wait for the plant to grow. When it reaches about 8 inches in height, add more soil, covering about half of the stem. Repeat the process until the container is full. Then wait for the flowering stage and for the leaves to begin drying out. That is the signal that the tubers have finished developing. And then you harvest. That's it. No expensive products. No specialized equipment. Just method, patience, and observation. And the result will surprise you in a way that makes it hard to go back to conventional planting once you've experienced it. There is one last thing I want to leave with you before we finish. The knowledge I'm sharing here didn't start with me. It passed through many hands before it reached mine. And by sharing it with you, I'm simply continuing a chain that began long before the Amish, long before any name we might attach to it. It's the chain of knowledge that comes from the land itself. And that knowledge belongs to everyone, but only if it continues to be passed forward. When you apply this method, you are honoring everyone who cultivated this knowledge before you. And when you share it with someone else, whether here in the comments or during a conversation in the backyard, you are helping ensure that this chain isn't broken by a world moving too fast to look at the soil beneath its feet. This channel exists to preserve that kind of knowledge, to rescue techniques that work from being forgotten by a modern world that moved too quickly past them. If you want to keep learning, keep discovering these old practices that still have real value and practical use in everyday life, subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and share it with someone you know will benefit from what you learned today. The healthiest food is the food you grow yourself, with your own hands, with soil, and with the knowledge of those who learn to observe nature instead of trying to dominate it. That's what we have here, and that's what we will keep building together. See you in the next video.